Welcome sports fans to GenX Classic Sports, where we bring the nostalgia of our sports-filled youth into the present day. Grab your favorite retro jersey, crack open a cold one, and let's stroll down memory lane together.
Welcome back, everybody, to GenX Classic Sports. I'm your host, Sean Enos, and today we're going to move away from baseball. I don't know if it's for the whole year, and we'll see what happens maybe in the postseason if that brings up anything I want to cover. But for right now, let's switch over to football because, hey, it's football season. So there's a name that all of you college football fans, or really high school and football fans, need to know. And it's Emory Bellard. Emory Bellard. All college football fans should know the name Emory Bellard. Yes, he was a head coach at Texas A&M and Mississippi State in the 70s and early 80s. But you should know his name because he revolutionized the game of football. Despite what we see with our own eyes now, there was a time in football when the thing you worried about the most was not giving up a big passing play. It wasn't a quarterback dropping back and launching a 50-yard bomb. And it wasn't a hurry-up offense. It wasn't the spread formation and four wide receivers all lined up completely across the field. No, it was none of that. What terrified defenses in the past was a much simpler situation. It was a quarterback taking a snap from under the center and offering the ball to his fullback, who was exploding up the middle of the line, and a halfback at the same time was striding towards the edge of the line, and a defender standing there for a split second, knowing that one wrong decision could mean watching an opponent sprint 70 yards down the field. Because once upon a time, college football and high school football belonged to the Wishbone, and its inventor was Emory Bellard. And for nearly 3 decades, from the late 1960s through the 80s, the Wishbone wasn't just an offensive formation. The Wishbone was a football empire. It won national championships in college, and it won state titles in high school. It produced legendary coaches. It turned programs into powerhouses, and it forced every defense in America to answer the same question: can you stop the option? Because the genius of the Wishbone was that everyone knew what was coming. That was the beautiful contradiction. There's no mystery and there's no deception much, really, in the modern sense of the word. The offense wasn't trying to trick you with complicated formations and endless motions and all those things that we see on television now. The offense was telling you exactly what it wanted to do. We're going to run the football. We're going to make you defend every inch of the field, and we're going to make one defender choose between being right or being wrong. And if he chooses wrong, we're going to take advantage of it. For years, that simple philosophy dominated college football and high school. The University of Texas built championships around it in college. So did Oklahoma. Alabama ended up adopting it. Nebraska refined it. High schools across the country copied it, and generations of quarterbacks learned how to read defensive ends instead of throwing 40-yard touchdown passes. In high school in the mid-'80s, we ran the option where I went to school, but not out of the Wishbone. A lot of teams back then had converted over to running the option, out of the I formation or whatever. So that gave you a little bit more flexibility. But the option principles, regardless of the formation, were the same. And then, seemingly as quickly as it arrived, the Wishbone began to disappear. That the offense that once represented the future of football kind of became a relic of the past. By the 90s, especially the late 90s, most major college programs had moved on. The quarterbacks who once were legends because they could run the option were replaced by quarterbacks who could throw for 2,500 yards a year. Remember when the Wishbone and the option QBs from college, even the great ones, were not even given a chance in pro football? We've talked about some of this before. Back then, option quarterbacks were typically given the chance to play pro ball, but it would be a late round draft pick or an undrafted free agent pickup, and they'd have to switch to running back or wide receiver or D-back. Not many of them got the chance to be a starting quarterback in the NFL. Also, the three-back formations, they disappeared. The wishbone, therefore, kind of became old-fashioned. So here's the question. Did the wishbone actually fail, or did football simply kind of evolve beyond it? Because the truth to me, it's kind of complicated. The wishbone didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because the entire sport changed around it. Television changed, recruiting changed, the NFL changed, defenses changed. From the wishbone, you saw more eye and pro set stuff, which increased the passing game, and then on to under center with empty backfields, and then on to the spread. And here's the fascinating part, is that the spread offense borrowed a whole lot of its ideas from the wishbone and the things that made the wishbone great. Do you guys think that? Do you believe that? Because a lot of things changed with the spread, but the option was still part of it. Make defenders choose, create numbers, advantages, force, decision-making and hesitation, attack space. And so the formation changed, but the philosophy kind of remained. A lot of those wishbone teams continued running what we used to call the three-part option, but they ran it out of different formations. And so that's kind of the story of the rise and fall of the wishbone empire, as how it evolved like everything else does in football. So to understand why the wishbone became revolutionary, we have to go back to the time before it existed, because every great football innovation starts trying to solve a problem. And in the 1960s, college football had a problem. For decades, football offenses were built around power. The game was about controlling the line of scrimmage, and that is true. It's always been about controlling the line of scrimmage. It was about bigger linemen overpowering maybe smaller and weaker defenders. It was about a fullback taking the ball straight into the teeth of the defense and lead blocking around the edge for a speedier running back. Football was a game of force. The most popular offenses were variations of the old T formation or the split T or the I. That is at least a progression from my experiences and observations. My wife's grandfather started coaching football, high school and junior high football, in 1946. And he told me that around that time, the school that he was coaching at was using a formation called the Notre Dame box. And he talked about that at length, and I've looked it up, and it existed, made popular by Notre Dame. And that was 4 guys in the backfield. And from that, he learned at a coaching clinic some T and split T formation concepts, and then brought that into sort of modernizing what was going on. But we've all heard this stuff about wings and wing T's and the dead T and split T's and all this stuff. And he knew all the way back to the Notre Dame box. So I find that pretty interesting. The philosophy for all these things was pretty simple. Find your best running back or your best runner. Sometimes he obviously may be the guy taking the snap a lot of times. Give him the football and let your offensive line control the game by creating holes. Run through those holes and get your yardage and run the clock, etc. But defenses, they got smarter, they got faster, sometimes they got bigger, and coaches were always searching for ways to create confusion without needing necessarily bigger and stronger players. In high school especially, you can't create that. You can't make that happen. In college, you can try to recruit bigger, faster guys. It doesn't always work out. So their coaches are always trying to create confusion. And one of those coaches was Emory Bellard. And Bellard wasn't looking to create a revolution necessarily. He's just looking for an advantage for his football teams, for his offense. He was studying defenses and noticing something important. Emory Bellard noticed that defensive players were becoming really, really disciplined, and they were no longer simply just charging up the field absent-mindedly. They were reading keys and they were watching what the offensive linemen did, how they lined up differently perhaps, the first step they took, all these kinds of things. So the defenses were getting smarter and so were the defensive coaches, and they were learning tendencies. So Bellard got to thinking, what if the offense could force defenders to hesitate a little bit before they committed and, moved? What if instead of blocking every defender, the offense could make defenders responsible for making a decision? And that idea would eventually become the foundation of the Wishbone. Before the Wishbone, there were other attempts to solve the same problem, of course. The option offense wasn't new. Just about all offenses go back to some form of the option. The idea of reading defenders and deciding whether to keep it, pitch it, hand it off, pass it, or whatever had existed for years. You can see this in old YouTube clips and the old grainy black and white images from 100 years ago. Coaches experimented all the way back with the single wing. And as I said before, the oldest offense I can come up with is the Notre Dame box because of my wife's grandfather coaching that. That goes all the way back into the 20s. And that ended up being replaced by the T formation and wing concepts that started getting popular in the 40s and 50s. The wing T, and then later on you had the veer, the split T. The great innovation of the Wishbone was not inventing option football. I never said that, and neither did anybody else. The Wishbone isn't the invention of the option, but it had a big role in perfecting it. It created a system where the defenses could be physically outnumbered and mentally overwhelmed. And the person who helped bring that idea to national prominence was University of Texas head football coach Darrell Royal, who actually hired our man Emory Bellard and brought him into the Texas staff out of high school. In fact, I found a video of Darrell Royal, and he actually called the formation the Wishbone T, which is kind of funny to me. I don't know. I never heard that. He called it the Wishbone T. And Darrell Royal was already a legend in Austin, of course. He had won a national championship earlier in the 60s. He had built Texas into one of the most respected programs in the country. But by the late 60s, he was searching for something new and different because college football was changing around him and defenses were catching up. This power on power thing, the defenses started, getting better at it. And so he thought Texas needed something new and an answer, and that answer came from Emory Bellard. Royal moved Bellard from a defensive assistant to the offensive coordinator in 1968 heading into that season. And Bellard had developed a formation that looked kind of strange. It was based on the veer offense and the slot I, and its roots and principles can be traced even farther back to modifications of the T formation made by a junior high coach named Charles Kaysen, I believe, in Fort Worth, Texas. And the philosophy back then evolved in order to get the fullback closer to the line of scrimmage and give a slower fullback a little bit of a spatial advantage. That's where some of this came from. But in this new system, Bellard had three backs line up behind the quarterback, one directly behind him, two slightly behind and to the outside. And from above, of course, that inverted V alignment looks like a wishbone. And so the name stuck. And the beauty of the formation was its simplicity. The quarterback had, by the way, the formation itself, if I remember correctly, the guards lined up 2 feet on each side of the center, and the tackles lined up 3 feet on each side of the guards. And on one side, you typically had a tight end who was also a 2 or 3 foot spaced out. On the other side, to give flexibility to what you were trying to do, you often had a split end out wide. And so one side of the line was going to be weak with no tight end and so forth. But basically, that was the concept. So in principle, basically, the quarterback had 3 choices on any given play. You could give the ball to the fullback. You could keep it, the quarterback could keep it himself and run towards the edge of the formation out wide. And then when he got out there, he had a third option, which was to pitch it to a trailing halfback. That's exactly how we ran it in junior high and high school in South Arkansas in the 80s. And I can tell you that a whole lot of teams we played ran it as well. And when I say we ran it, we didn't run the wishbone necessarily. We ran some of that out of the I or the power I, but we played against wishbone teams and power I teams as well. So 3 options for the quarterback, and all were runs. And let's remember that detail for later, that all 3 options were runs. 1 play, 3 options, and every defender had to decide which option to try to stop. The wishbone wasn't about tricking anybody. It was about making defenses make bad decisions and then punishing them for them. In 1968, Texas decided to unleash this new offense on college football, and the results would change the sport for a long time because the wishbone wasn't just another formation. It really started a couple of different empires, actually. I guess I should say several, because I can think of 3 right now actually 4 that the wishbone and its option principles helped tremendously in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in college football, and then countless high school programs were successful with it as well around the country. So every great sports or football revolution begins with somebody willing to challenge the way things have always been done. That's why I love topics like this. In the late 60s, college football was still very much a game of tradition. Coaches had their systems, programs had their identities. And most coaches believed success came from perfecting what already worked. And sometimes the biggest changes in sports don't come from somebody creating something completely new. They come from somebody who looks at something that exists and looks at it a little bit differently and puts its own spin on it. And that, of course, was our guy Emory Bellard and our story. Bellard was not a famous college head coach. He wasn't a household name, and he wasn't the face of a national championship program. He was a high school coach from Texas who had developed a reputation as one of the smartest offensive minds in the state. And in Texas high school football, of course, it's not just a sport, it's a way of life. Every Friday night, coaches are studying film, designing plays, searching for the smallest advantage that can help their team win on Friday nights. Bellard was one of those dudes. He wasn't trying to revolutionize college football. He was trying to solve a problem for Darrell Royal and the Texas Longhorns. How do you create an offense that puts pressure on the defense without needing necessarily bigger, stronger, faster players? How do you make something work tactically instead of with, better players necessarily? And so the answer was the option, and instead of asking the offense to overpower the defense, Bellard wanted to make the defense choose. And so, being that football's always been a numbers game, he wanted to create a numbers matchup somewhere to the offensive's advantage. And he realized the offense could create such an advantage by forcing one dude to cover 2 possibilities. One man, 2 possibilities. And a defensive end couldn't crash down the line for a running back and stop the quarterback. And a linebacker couldn't fill the hole and defend a pitch out wide. So someone was going to be wrong in this play that had 3 options to it. And if the offense made the correct read, that mistake could become a big play or touchdown. And so that idea eventually caught the attention of Darrell Royal. And, he was one of the most respected guys in college football, and he already had Texas moving into national powerhouse territory. But even great programs, they cannot stand still forever. And they had been successful running a traditional power-type offense, but Royal knew the game was changing, and defenses were getting way more athletic and smarter, and the old ways were harder to maintain. So he embraced Bellard's offense. In 1968, Texas started out with the new formation. So the quarterback was no longer simply a passer or a handoff machine, like a balanced old school attack. The quarterback became a decision maker, and he better be a good runner as well, because every play was a test. read the defensive end, read the linebacker, make the choice, live with the result. And the first quarterback to run Texas's new offense successfully was James Street. And when Texas started the season 0-1-1 in 1968, they switched to Street as their quarterback, looking for a little bit of a spark. And in 1968, after starting 0-1-1, with Street running the option, the Wishbone option, Texas rolled off 9 straight wins, including a Cotton Bowl victory over Tennessee at New Year's. And Street was the perfect guy for what Royal wanted. Not flashy, and he wasn't considered a future NFL quarterback, but he was smart and tough and confident. If you don't believe me, just ask Arkansas fans, but that's a topic for another day. Exactly the kind of player needed to run the system. That was James Street. The Wishbone was not built around a superstar throwing a football to a superstar wide receiver. It was built around a quarterback making decisions, and that's what Street was good at. And so Texas embraced it, and Texas ran with it, and Texas rolled off those 9 wins at the end of the 1968 season. Now, since you're all sports fans along with me, or you wouldn't be listening, you know as well as I do that the opponents took notice of that. And so they didn't try to fight it, they tried to copy it. Because, when an idea changes the game, everybody can either fight against it or join it. And so college football chose option number 2, to join in. And so the Wishbone went from a Texas experiment to a national movement. Every great powerhouse program begins with a big victory, and every new philosophy begins with a big victory. And for the Wishbone, that victory was Texas winning the 1969 national championship the following season. And they capped that off by beating Notre Dame at the Cotton Bowl, going 11-0 that season. And that was after winning 9 games in a row the season before. So ideas like the Wishbone definitely helped create some of these dynasties. And of course, since it was such a great idea, they couldn't keep it to themselves. And so here we go. Everybody else starts studying film and stealing from them and borrowing things and taking advantage of something successful, right? And so pretty soon it became apparent in 1968 and 9, the question was no longer, can the Wishbone work? It was, how do we make this work for us so that we can get in on this deal, right? And so the first program, ironically, to embrace the Wishbone revolution was Texas's biggest rival, and that would be Oklahoma. And that created one of the greatest offensive identities in college football history. When a lot of you dudes my age think of Oklahoma, you think about the Wishbone offense. And that's because Oklahoma actually ran the bone longer than Texas did. The Sooners didn't invent it, of course, but they sure perfected the idea. Their coach, Chuck Fairbanks, adopted the Wishbone in the early 70s after seeing Texas, of course, run it. And when Barry Switzer became the offensive coordinator, they really became almost unstoppable, and then into his head coaching career. He understood that the Wishbone was, it wasn't about trick plays. It was about creating a system that you could implement, a philosophy, a way of life for the offense, so to speak. Oklahoma didn't run the Wishbone either because they lacked passing talent. If you're about my age, which you are, you're probably not listening. If you're about my age, you know that when Oklahoma was on TV in the mid-'80s into the late 80s, there were plenty of highlights of big passing plays in their Wishbone offense. And I'm talking about Keith Jackson mostly. I knew even at a young age Keith Jackson was going to be just fine in the NFL because he just made so many big plays for Oklahoma in the passing game. So had they wanted to, and actually they tried to with Troy Aikman, that's a whole other story we'll cover someday. But Switzer tried to kind of modernize and become more of a passing attack with Aikman. Didn't work out for various reasons. But yeah, Oklahoma could have recruited and thrown the ball had they wanted to, but they chose to do this. They ran it because the Wishbone because they believed it gave them a chance to dominate, and they certainly did. They became one of the most feared offenses in college football as they won national championships. They produced All-American running backs. They controlled the Big 8 conference there for a while. And every Saturday, opponents knew exactly what was coming. The Sooners were going to mostly run the football, and then when they did throw it, it was going to be a huge play usually. And so could anybody stop it? That was the issue. And it was such a good attack that Oklahoma set a record for rushing yards per game in 1971 with 472 yards per game, which is still a record for average yards rushing per game for an entire season. Then, not one to be left out of the party either, someone else got in on the action. Oklahoma wasn't the only convert. Few coaches represented the old school football more than old Bear Bryant, right? His teams were certainly built on toughness and defense and physicality and power football. And for years, Alabama had won by lining up and beating teams at the point of attack. But even those kinds of legendary coaches have to adapt when they see things that's going on around them, right? And so after watching the option have so much success, Bryant realized that the game was changing, and he embraced elements of the wishbone and the option attack as well, starting in 1971. And that decision kept the Crimson Tide, among the nation's elite programs, continued the tradition there. And the coach who represented traditional football the most, Bear Bryant, was willing to change because he understood something that is important in that tradition doesn't really mean refusing to evolve. Tradition means finding new ways to win. And I would venture to say that Nick Saban went through the same thing in his career at Alabama. He changed his offensive philosophy as well. Okay. And then there was another team that decided they were going to do this as well, or their version of it, and that was Nebraska. All right. I grew up watching the Cornhuskers when I could. It was limited, maybe a time or two a year, watching the Cornhuskers run the option as well. And the Cornhuskers took the ideas behind the wishbone and created their version of option football. Now, I didn't dig into this enough to say they actually never ran the wishbone formation. I don't know. I'm assuming they did some. Under Tom Osborne, Nebraska became famous for the I option and power option attacks. Now, I don't know how they define power option. It could be running from the power I formation, which was, the I formation, but you pulled in a third guy and it was kind of an offset wishbone. If you did that, that's my way of describing it. So I think that's what they're talking about. Because I didn't see much of them, but I enjoyed watching their highlights. But by the way, since we're speaking on that, Nebraska ran the option. I can remember Colorado with Darian Hagan running the option so well. Arkansas was running the option back then with a couple of different quarterbacks who were really good at it. I mean, there were a lot of programs running some form of the option and out of the wishbone and the eye. I think, and I wrote this down somewhere, I'm almost positive I've seen highlights of Bo Jackson scoring and whatnot on option plays that were out of the I formation as well. So I think that might have been at least part of Bo's experience as well. Nebraska didn't exactly run the Texas wishbone. They run more of the I based stuff. That's more or less what happened when I was in high school. But it carried the same DNA and creates the same advantages and controls the clock the same way, punishes defenses the same way. And so Nebraska became one of the most physically dominant programs in college football. I can remember seeing footage of Nebraska's offensive line and just marveling at how those dudes were NFL-sized offensive lines, it seemed like, year after year after year. So that offense was built around those massive lines and powerful fullbacks and quarterbacks who could make decisions on the fly. So, players like Johnny Rodgers and Turner Gill and Tommy Frazier and a whole bunch of others became symbols of a football philosophy that really valued precision and power over flashiness, I guess. And so By the late 70s and early 80s, the influence of the Wishbone was everywhere. Like I said, the high schools coast to coast were running it. All these college programs, by the way, I've only mentioned the top college programs at the time. All those teams I just mentioned were doing really well in the 70s and 80s with some version of the option. That's not even counting all the college programs beyond those, Power Five type schools. So coaches everywhere were studying it. It became especially popular in areas where speed was available, but elite passing quarterbacks and receivers too were hard to find, which makes total sense in high school. A team didn't need a future NFL quarterback. In high school, you could just take a running back who could just throw a spiral and move him to quarterback to run the option, and that worked out for a whole lot of dudes back then. You needed a smart quarterback, you needed a disciplined offensive line, and you needed running backs who knew what they were doing, plant a foot and go. And so that's what made the wishbone and the option, whatever formation it came out of, so fun to watch. A smaller program could use it against bigger programs, and that's why the military academies use it, I would imagine. I don't know exactly, but they're known for using the option in the wishbone, and I think it's because it's easier to teach and interchangeable for guys and things. And so I bet that's why they don't reinvent the wheel every 4 years. And a team without five-star recruits could still create problems for defenses. And so the offensive coaches, of course, wanted to level the playing field, which, if you think about it, that reminds you and me of the spread offense doing the exact same thing around central Arkansas here. All over the state of Arkansas. I remember small high schools that had limited numbers and limited size and all that kind of stuff going to spread offenses. They'd find one kid who could get the ball out there, and they tried to even the playing field by throwing 4 and 5 wide receivers out there. So these things come and go. That's what makes it fun to talk about. Now, for 2 decades nearly, college football was, all about the wishbone. Some, of course, wanted to throw it and were more balanced, the 50-50 balance thing. And I remember teams like the Hurricanes having prototypical quarterbacks, straight drop back, throwing the ball down the field vertically, but also handing off and having that balance. So quarterbacks under the center and, that kind of thing. So the wishbone it was an identity, it really was. But by the late 80s, they were starting to show some cracks were beginning to appear. The wishbone was still effective. It could still win games, but college football was changing pretty fast, and television audiences were changing, and the way players were recruited was changing, and the future of football was kind of beginning to move in a different direction. But the first signs of decline were definitely appearing by the late 80s. Now, the actual formation of the wishbone mostly disappeared at some point. I said mostly, there's always exceptions, but the idea behind it really never did. Modern football is built on a lot of the same principles: the zones, the reads, the read options, the RPO, quarterbacks making defenders choose, offenses creating space and forcing one player to cover 2 possibilities. So the names of these things changed, and the formations changed, and the personnel types changed, but the philosophy's really still there for the largest part. The wishbone's greatest kind of contribution, I guess, it was the realization that an offense could win just by making the defense think more than just attack. Possibly one of the things that changed the wishbone was the position of quarterback. For decades, college football did not necessarily view the quarterback as a future NFL passer. Instead, quarterbacks were seen as field generals and decision makers. They managed the offense. And the wishbone fit into that perfectly due to all the things we've already talked about. The quarterback didn't have to throw for 300 yards every week. He needed to make the correct reads in the run game, and he needed to protect the football and run the offense and therefore run the clock. But college football changed. It became more connected to the NFL. The definition of a quarterback actually changed because of that connection to the NFL. College football quarterbacks wanted to play in the NFL on Sundays. And so coaches kind of started recruiting guys who looked like NFL quarterbacks, tall, strong arm, pocket passers. And the guy who ran the Wishbone was often a brilliantly elite athlete in college. But the NFL teams were not lining up to draft quarterbacks whose biggest strength was carrying the football. They wanted pocket passers because back then there wasn't a whole lot of NFL teams copying college teams. We know it's happened lately, but back then there were two different worlds. The NFL didn't go, oh, look at that Wishbone, let's start running that. It didn't happen. Okay, when the NFL evolved into the balanced pocket throwing quarterback, the entire NFL did that, and they needed passers. And so that changed how high school or how college coaches recruited, because suddenly you've got a kid in high school saying, what are you going to do to help me get to the NFL? I'm a passer. And so you can only say no too many times, and then you got to change the way you think about things. So a high school quarterback with dreams of playing in the NFL, he wanted to play in an offense that showcased his arm. He wanted to throw, he wanted those stats, and he wanted highlight tapes of those touchdown passes. And that created a problem for the option offenses, and the best quarterbacks were increasingly choosing those balanced pocket passer type offenses. And really, to illustrate that, I'm not going to go into it on this episode, but all you need to know about that whole issue is the Troy Aikman story of how he wound up at Oklahoma out of high school, and yet also how he ended up leaving Oklahoma out of college, and yet how he ended up at UCLA and why. That's a fascinating story that perfectly illustrates what I'm talking about, and we'll cover that at some point, I'm sure. Another factor changed, and that was television. College football was popular. In the 80s and 90s, football started being broadcast a lot more. There were more options for watching it because, as I've covered on here before, I got one game a week usually as a kid, and it was regional. And you might get one national game as well. But more fans were watching more games on television, and offense is entertaining. It just is. Go back and look at the scoreboard scores from the 60s and 70s and 80s and compare them to today at any level of football. And those 10-7 games became 20-17 games, and then they became 30-20 games, and now a lot of them are 42-35 games. That's the way the sport evolved, and that creates excitement, and that sells tickets, and that creates viewership on television. And so, hey, Arkansas fans can tell you they lost a coach who went back-to-back winning the Southwest Conference with his version of the Wishbone, Ken Hatfield. It was called the Flexbone, and he got ran out of town because some people started thinking that offense was too boring. So these things happened, and the pressure was on. Around that time that happened to Ken Hatfield, that's what was going on. The Hurricanes and some other teams were running these pro-looking offenses, and the fans wanted to know why they weren't throwing the ball more. So it happened. The passing game scores more points. It just does. And it was exciting. And that's what fans love seeing in the stands and on the television. So that grinded out type of football, even though, the Wishbone was more exciting than a lot of its predecessors and the option game was, it still became too boring for a lot of people who were in charge of such things. So it changed recruiting out of high school. They had to change. In the 70s, a great athlete was often what you needed, and a coach could find players who fit into that system. A quarterback who was smart and tough, and running backs who could make quick decisions, and linemen who loved to play physical football. But as recruiting became more competitive, players gained a lot more control over their futures, and they wanted their opportunities, and wide receivers were part of that as well. They wanted catches for a career. Running backs wanted more carries, not sharing it with two other guys. Hey, put me in the back of the I formation and let me be the main ball carrier. The Wishbone being more democratic and spreading the load among four running backs and not throwing the ball very often, everybody contributed. But modern recruiting became more about exposure as television and contracts grew and all that kind of stuff. So between that and the defensive athletes getting faster and the coaches, kind of catching up because modern defenses became different. They valued speed. Jimmy Johnson was famous for valuing speed over anything. And I've heard him say multiple times that his philosophy with his defensive linemen was to charge up the field, assuming you're going to go get a sack. And if they hand the ball off, then you'll make that tackle too. So he was all about going up the field and creating chaos. And it just changed things. You had to find guys that were flexible and could play multiple roles on defense, be versatile. A linebacker had to be able to cover, maybe in the slot, running backs out of the backfield. Defensive ends had to chase quarterbacks around a lot more. Safeties needed to be able to play near the line of scrimmage. I mean, it changed so much. When the offense changes, the defense has to react to it and so forth. So that's really what we're talking about. And so all of that is to say this. The wishbone eventually gave way to the I formations of the world and things like that. And then all of that gave way to shotgun formations and spread offenses, and then pistol formations and spread offenses, and then the three running options became 2 or 3 running options mixed with a passing option in there in the RPO game. So if you're my age listening to this, we've all seen this evolve, and we know exactly where we are now with all of this spread stuff. It's changed so much about the game, but according to the research, now I never played in a spread offense technically, but according to the research, the wishbone deserves the credit, and the option game deserves the credit for a lot of what's done now. And there's I can mention some names that it would have been really interesting to see how they would have performed in the old school option attacks. But think about guys like Michael Vick and Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen running some of those old offenses. It really makes you wonder what they could have done, just focusing on the things that the old school wishbone option quarterbacks focused on. So the whole point is that the wishbone reminds a bunch of us gray-headed dudes, man, the wishbone lives on. The late offensive mastermind Mike Leach said it best. Nobody has ever truly stopped the wishbone. There's a point where people have lost interest in the wishbone, but nobody ever really successfully stopped it. What a great quote from the late Mike Leach. Rest in peace. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention this week as we start football season that how much I used to love watching some of these games with this offensive philosophy. Enjoyed playing it in high school and so forth. And I'm guessing a lot of you have your own memories of whether you ran it as a high school or college player, or whether you defended against it, or whether you really enjoyed watching your favorite team play this style of offense. It's just such a piece of history, kind of a short-lived situation, really, if you look at the numbers. But I thought it was fun to talk about where this whole wishbone thing came from. It sounds like we owe a lot of gratitude to Mr. Emory Bellard for inventing the wishbone that a lot of us enjoyed watching over the years. So that's it for this week. Welcome back to football season. Hopefully it'll cool off soon as well. And hey, we need listeners. Tell people about us. Click like, click subscribe, click share, and we'll be back with some more football for a while next week. And this has been your host, Sean Enos. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for joining us on GenX Classic Sports, where nostalgia meets the thrill of the game. Tune in next time for more insightful discussions and memorable moments, brought to you by Pine Street Productions. Until then, stay passionate about sports and keep the memories alive.